Hello and welcome back to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. To kick off season 4, we have the very special Saurabh Mukherjea with us. For those of you who don't know Saurabh is the founder and chief investment officer at Marcellus Investment Managers, a portfolio management service which runs an AUM of over 10,000 crores. Known for his consistent compounders and the traditional coffee can investing strategy, Saurabh has penned over 4 or 5 books, multiple newsletters, blogs about his theory, talking about the investing world, and a lot more. An ardent cricket fan, Saurabh has brought about a revolution to the PMS industry and how Indians go about investing. But one of the interesting things that Saurabh does, unlike a lot of other fund managers, is be a voracious reader and base a lot of his knowledge and his theories based on things that he reads beyond the financial markets. Without giving a lot of it away, let's jump right into the interview. Hi, Saurabh. Welcome to the Kitabi Karwan podcast. I'm so glad to have you on the air. Before we begin, I'll just like to give you about 30 seconds to a minute to brief our readers or listeners about what you do, what your book's about. I personally know what you do I work in the financial market, so I know you as an author, as from your work as well. But for our listeners.
So look, we at Marcellus Investment Managers, we manage the equity market savings of around 10,000 families in India, plus some corporates in India, plus some British and American universities. We invest through something called Portfolio Management Services. It's a license that the regulator SEBI grants, wherein we can set up, for sake of example, we can set up Siddharth Gupta's portfolio specific to Siddharth Gupta. It's in his Demat account. Siddharth simply gives us a power of attorney to operate Siddharth's Demat account, and we buy in Siddharth's Demat account stocks that meet our investment philosophy. Our investment philosophy, which is outlined in the book, which is behind Siddharth's head. The book is called Diamonds in the Dust. Our investment philosophy is look for clean companies, promoters who are not stealing money. Secondly, amongst the cleaner companies, look for promoters who are allocating capital sensibly, intelligently. We measure that by looking for return on capital above the cost of capital over a 10 to 15 year period. So step one, clean accounts. Step two, intelligent capital allocation. And the third thing that we look for is companies where the prices that the company is charging are 10, 20, 30% higher than the peer group. Right. So looking for dominant franchises alongside clean accounts and good capital allocation. We've in the 14 years I've lived in India, my colleagues and I have found around 35 such companies. Then they form Marcellus's large cap, mid cap, and small cap portfolios. And that's it. We trade very little. We buy and sell very little in a given year. In a typical portfolio, in a given year, we will buy one stock. In a given year, we will sell one stock. That might sound unusual, but there are actually some very successful fund managers outside India who sell one stock every 4 years. Right? So we are actually, compared to fund managers who buy and sell one stock every 4 years, firms like, say, Lindsay Train, reputed fund managers based out of London, or Terry Smith, who buy and sell very little, we actually buy and sell one stock a year. And that leaves us plenty of time to write books such as Diamonds in the Dust and speak to interesting people like Siddharth.
Thank you, Saurabh. So, Saurabh, this was a very interesting insight into what you do and a great summary at that for Diamonds in the Dust. But that's something that I wanted to ask you. So, being a writer, was it something that, comes as part of the job? Because I don't see a lot of fund managers in India writing books, right? Or does it come out of a hobby? Is this something that you've always wanted to do? Or is it just in a way of kind of spreading discourse regarding the philosophy your fund believes in?
So I think when I went through my CFA charter 2001, 2, 3, and then I worked in the UK I worked in the British stock market for around 9 years, and then I worked in India for 18 years. I have never found a fund manager anywhere in the world who isn't a very good articulator, right? And most notably, obviously, Warren Buffett, right? Legendarily good articulator. And therefore, long before we became investors in Marcellus, we realized very early on in our development that if you can't think, speak, and write clearly, it is very, very unlikely you'll be a successful investor. Right? So thinking clearly, speaking clearly, and writing clearly is a prerequisite for this job. Not least because it clarifies your own thinking It clarifies your own intellectual process if you put things down on paper and present it to the audience, right? You get feedback. Reading your own writing will give you more rigor in your thinking, and getting feedback, right? If you publish a book like Diamonds in the Dust, which sells by the lakhs, that feedback itself is incredibly enriching. So long before we became investors, we realized that, reading, say, Warren Buffett or a Philip Fisher, or a Peter Lynch, it was very clear that it's very difficult to be a good fund manager if you're not a clear thinker, clear speaker, and a good writer.
Yeah. Right. So, okay. So, because that is something again I've observed, right? I mean, I think this is something a lot of people would agree with, that even when people invest in certain schemes or, I mean, mutual fund or whatever, I mean, I've noticed Marcellus is very active on the writing front, that there are newsletters and blogs and like
And
the
we
books
say
that are coming out.
we're not just
Right.
active writing front to just sort of to beat up, beat our own drum and spread the message.
Hmm.
Our point is, if we can't tell you clearly what we are doing,
Right.
either through a book or through a newsletter or through a webinar or a session like this, if we can't tell you what we're doing, on what basis will you invest with us?
Absolutely.
Right? As everybody knows, past performance is not the best way to assess a fund manager, right? So
Right.
if we can't tell you what we are doing, what basis will you invest with us? Or let's take an even simpler message. Suppose we were selling food processors rather than fund management.
Right.
Suppose we were selling food processors, and I could not explain to you the features of my product and how our food processor has been created. What is the reason you should buy our food processor? Why will Siddharth then buy the food processor? So it's very strange, right? There are two very interesting things about fund management which stand out. One is this notion that fund management somehow doesn't have to be explained to others. You will somehow, the fund manager believes just the sheer presence will be enough for Siddharth to buy the product. That doesn't work. I think I'm pretty sure most people watching this will say the presence of a fund manager and his view on the market is not what we are looking to invest in. We are looking to understand what does the fellow do.
Right.
How has he constructed his investment philosophy? How does he identify stocks and invest in stocks? And therefore,
Right.
it behooves us to be very clear about that. The other interesting facet, and I think this is the flip side of the first point, is normally people don't believe that they are, for example, that they can do open heart surgery, or that they can make a Michelin starred meal,
Right.
or that they can direct a movie. But
Right.
somehow, a lot of people believe they can do fund management. So a lot of members of the public believe that whilst they will not try their hand at making, say, caramel custard, and they won't try their hand at batting in a T20 match or in open heart surgery, somehow they believe fund management is fair game and they'll go and have a punt with their money. So both of these sort of delusions, I
Right.
think, are mirror images of each other. The fund manager's delusion that communication isn't required,
Right.
and the public's delusion that buying and selling stocks, that's something that you can turn your hand to whenever you feel it.
Right. Okay, so Saurabh, I'm going to take a step back for this conversation, right? And this is again comes from my observation, the fact that you and again people at Marcellus are voracious advocates of the fact that people ought to read a lot more, right? I mean, even when for your customers and for you're always peppered with suggestions of books that have inspired you or books that help you build your philosophy. So I mean, I just want to know, where did this start for you? Was this something your parents put on you that you should read, or do you just generally like to read in general, or is it just finance books that you kind of focus on in life?
I don't think that. I mean, obviously, I grew up in a household where there wasn't that much money going around. So
Right.
one of the few things my parents could buy me was second-hand books, and
Right.
becoming a library member wasn't then and isn't now particularly expensive, and it's a low cost, easy hobby to pick up. But that apart, right? That apart, Siddharth, again, as the years have gone by and as I've gotten older, I've realized that, and I'm paraphrasing Charlie Munger here. I'm paraphrasing Charlie Munger, that you rarely meet intelligent people who don't read non-stop, right? And that's just as true in India. Many of the promoters of our investee companies, they're not sort of formally qualified. They don't have IIT, IIM qualifications, but they are incredibly well read and they're reading non-stop, right? A sign of a curious mind. Remember, curiosity is a superpower, right? In a world where change is a constant, curiosity is a superpower. Whether it's in a promoter, it's an analyst, a fund manager, someone working in IT services, doesn't matter. If you're a curious person,
Right.
your brain is going to the gym every day. Right? A
Right.
curious person's brain is gymming all the time. That brain is necessarily fitter, and a curious person necessarily seeks out reading material, right? And that's why the correlation between curious promoters, curious fund managers, curious analysts, curious people in general, and success tends to be very high. And reading is a via media
Right.
through which you give full vent to your curiosity.
Right. Right. No, so I get that. I completely, as a reader, I completely agree with what you say, right? I think curiosity is best satisfied by books in general. But what I'm actually more interested in is what got you interested in reading. I mean,
I
I'm
think
pretty sure like this is not something that you would have known as a kid.
we
Like,
model our behaviors. We model our
right,
behaviors of those around us.
right,
My parents were reading all the time, so I thought that was the thing to do, to read all the time. And my wife and I didn't really tell our children read all the time, but because we read all the time, they've
right,
ended up reading all the time. And
right,
I think that modeling aspect becomes really important. As child psychologists have repeatedly said, it's not what you tell your child that works. It's not what you tell your child. It's what your child sees you doing, which
right,
is the more main influence you have on your children's behavior. So in
right,
my parents' case, music and reading were big hobbies for them. As I said, given the income strata we were in, that was a couple of the things we could afford. And as I ended up picking it up from them, and so on, I passed it on to the kids and so on.
right. So, Saurabh, do you generally just read non-fiction? Is that something that you restrict yourself to, or is fiction
So
also a part of your repertoire?
I used to read plenty of fiction till I started working with John Kay in my early 20s.
Okay.
And then when I started working with John, this was shortly after after I graduated from the LSE. Then I
Right,
started working with John, and I realized just how much stuff John and his friends knew about the last 200 years of corporate life in many different countries. And I realized just how many case studies and how many companies' accounts and evolution John and his friends knew. I realized that that's the bank of that's the bank of knowledge that I also want to build. So once I encountered John in my early 20s, after that it became very difficult to get myself interested in fiction. I do
right,
occasionally read so there's a treasure hunt in Marcellus post market hours today.
right.
So the treasure hunt is on Harry Potter
Oh,
and the Philosopher's Stone. So therefore, as part of the syllabus for the treasure hunt, I read Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. But that must be one of the rare fiction books I've read for a long, long time. But
right,
primarily, this love for nonfiction arose from working with John Kay and realizing that
right,
the richer your mental models, the deeper your knowledge about business history, about corporate history, the greater your ability to contextualize,
right,
the here and the now.
right. Yeah, that's actually a very fair point because I'll tell you why I was asking you the question. I personally believe that every writer or author, right, they are able. I mean, it's kind of because you're a cricket fan as well, you'd understand this that it's sort of net practice for them. That reading and is just refining your skill for that
Yeah.
particular job that you do in life, not just as a fund manager, but as
Yeah,
a
you're right. You very rarely find a successful
right,
writer
right,
who hasn't read loads and loads of books,
right,
right? And
right,
as Charlie Munger says, you'll rarely
right,
find an intelligent individual who
right,
hasn't read
right,
loads of books.
right. So, Saurabh, I mean, given that I mean, it's clear that your interest lies in finance and well, reading the same. But even within nonfiction, do you generally tend to read anything beyond fiction or finance or economics or things that would largely pertain to the markets? And if yes, do you feel that that actually helps you grow as a fund manager as well? I'm just trying to kind of tie in the fact that whether
So,
you'd have books that aren't related to your profession are helping you grow. And does that help you as a writer as well? Is another question because you write a lot on finance as well.
so we've written my friend Anupam Gupta and I have written a book how you train yourself in life, and it's got nothing to do with finance.
Right.
The book is called The Victory Project: 6 Steps to Peak Potential. So this was published, I think, two years ago. It's become a bestseller, and it's got nothing to do with finance. And the book that's coming out in March has got nothing to do with finance. It's about how to think under pressure, how to think in day-to-day life under stressful circumstances. Um, Bulk of my reading actually doesn't have that much to do with finance slash investing. I try to read as much as I can understand. I'm not a psychologist, but I try to read as much popular psychology as I can understand. I'm a big history buff, so I try to read plenty on economic history, both normal history and economic history. I've got a decent amount of interest in politics, both Western politics and in politics. Um, and I'm not a scientist. I studied sort of maths, physics, and maths in my high school, so I know a reasonable amount of popular science. But it's reading about a whole bunch of things that allow us to become better at what we do. So, for example, I just finished a meeting with my colleagues on technology and artificial intelligence and what sort of work streams we need to think about in 2023 around the AI. So if I don't read up on AI and I don't, within Marcellus, we were a thriving sort of group of people who send stuff to read, podcasts to read, books to read. And if we as a group in Marcellus don't read more on technology, on science, on history, on politics, then obviously we're going to become fairly narrow-minded in our view about investing. So books on investing per se beyond the point actually are not that interesting. It's the broader set of read around non-fiction that become very interesting.
Right. No, it's interesting you mentioned Anupam. Anupam was in our podcast in the previous season. I think he was one of the last episodes. Right. But and it's very heartening to hear you say this, because I think this is a message that goes out to a lot of our listeners as well, right? Because this is a conundrum a lot of people face, that there are people who read as for their hobby. I mean, they enjoy reading, and a lot of people who read because, well, they believe it will make them more successful or better at the profession. And this is something I think I personally believe in what you just said, that I think succeeding in life requires a lot more holistic knowledge than just knowledge of a particular field. So if you're reading and using it as a tool to kind of grow in your profession, you need to read beyond like the specific books on your profession, and just a lot of other things that kind of tie into your interest or your profession broadly to kind of have a more
I'll tell you
approach.
Why a lot of people in our line of work in investing don't. I'll tell you why I think a lot of people in investing don't read beyond investing. So there are schools of thought. One school of thought sees investing as a exercise in judgment, right? So in that school of thought, the investor is much like a high court judge, sitting, weighing up the facts, and using her wisdom to opine on, whether the plaintiff or the defendant is to be granted the victory in the case, right? So in that mode of thought, the investor is sort of wise person. Typically, in that mental model, the investor is a little older, wise, balanced, sane, calm, collected individual, right? So that's one type of mental model for how a great investor works, right? The other mental model is that investing is much like, say, being a creative person in the advertising field, right? To come up with a mind-blowing advertising campaign for a product which has been around 30 years old, you really need to have a very original mind, so that you're able to understand what the public wants, and you're able to launch an advertising campaign which captures the public's imagination. And in professions like that, or say professions anything to do with art and music, creativity is very highly priced, right? And in that sort of model, the creative fields, the successful person is seen as a slightly left field person. The get up will not be like yours and mine, wearing a colorless shirt like ours. They'll be probably wearing a colorful T-shirt. They might have slightly long hair and tattoos and so on and so forth, right? I believe the investment is more like the latter field rather than the former, because if you're going to be the exercising judgment, then it's unlikely your judgment will be consistently superior than the judgment of thousands of other investors, right? In a market where information is so widely available, on judgment alone, you're going to go very far. Investing fundamentally is about insight, and generating insight is no different in art, in literature, in music as it is in investing. And if you're going to generate insight, it's highly likely those insights will come from reading well beyond the field of finance, rather than just reading finance, accounting, and investing books.
Yeah, I think I like the idea behind it, that investing is an art, not a science. I think that's something, again, I really resonate with. So Saurabh, I'll just ask you a few pointed questions now. So what was the last book that you've read?
So I read Peter Turchin's book on on world history, War and Peace, War. Right. So Turchin had written about this was a book which came out 8 or 9 years ago, and is written about cycles of war. And he'd written the book 9 years ago, and he very clearly said we're going to go through another cycle of war. And I'd read it once 5 6 years ago. Once the conflict began in Ukraine and with China sort of doing whatever it's doing, I thought worth revisiting Peter Turchin and reading War and Peace and War to understand why this guy was able to so clearly see that we're heading for another era of conflict.
Okay. And Saurabh, if I would, I mean, I completely understand when this question is posed to a voracious reader like you, that I'm not asking you to name your favorite book, but like maybe a book or maybe a few books which have really impacted you as a person, right, over the years. Like, I mean, throughout your life, there might be some books that have stood out for you in terms of maybe shaping your philosophy about maybe anything, maybe work, maybe life, or just has impacted in terms of the way you think or just made you feel things. Maybe a couple of books on that end.
Sure. So I think one of the books that I have written about in my forthcoming book, a book that I've written about in my forthcoming book, as being very important and helping me see my life in a new light, was a book by a guy called Mihir Desai. Mihir Desai is a professor in Harvard, and he wrote a beautiful book 4 years ago called The Wisdom of Finance. Right? The Wisdom of Finance, and he used a variety of research from psychology, from science, from politics, from history, to show that a lot of what we do in investing, a lot of our behaviors as investors and say business people, a lot of our behaviors are not our own. We're simply mimicking, we're simply imitating what we have seen in other people. And secondly, we are playing out the wishes and desires of other people, including say our parents. Right. So there's a lovely chapter in the book where Mihir Desai reframes the principal agent problem. Right. Normally, principal agent problem is used to describe problems such as say corporate life, where the shareholders are the principal, the CEO is the agent. Right. But Mihir Desai reframes it to say the principal is your parents. You might have left home 20 years ago, but you're still living out the life your parents wanted you to live out. You think you're living your own life, but you're actually living out their desires, because that's how psychology and parenting works, right? So I was intrigued by that you can use economics frameworks to describe behaviors in real life, and you're basically using economics and psychology and tying them up in a very clever way. So it's a very good book, Mihir Desai, The Wisdom of Finance. There are many other very interesting insights in the right. And the second book, or a person that a French philosopher whose work has had immense influence on my life, is a man called René Girard. Right. So REA first name, and Girard Girard. So this is a guy who I found out about from Peter Thiel's books. This is the guy I found out about from Peter Thiel's books, and I went and read one of Girard's books called Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. Right, Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. I later realized it's a celebrated book. It was written, I think, around 50 years ago, but it is a mind-blowing book. What it tells us is pretty much everything we do in day-to-day life, we are mimicking others. Right, we live by what Girard calls mimesis. Mimesis is I'm wearing a shirt and you're wearing a shirt, not because both of us are saying we love shirts, but because we believe that's the done thing in daily life, right? Similarly, I covet a diamond, not because I have any independent judgment that a diamond should be coveted, but because I know everybody else also likes diamonds, because I also like diamond, right? Or I value a flat in Pedder Road, not because I have some profound view that Pedder Road is a great place to live in, but because I've been told that's what, if you're an aspirational person in Bombay, then to live in Pedder Road, Malabar Road Hills is the kind of way to go. Right? So mimesis becomes the standard way to lead life. That's how we build our careers. That's how we decide what to read. That's how we decide how to dress, how to frame our children's future. Nothing wrong with that, right? We are animals. We're social animals, and therefore we frame our lives by mimicking others. Problem is when we start coveting the same thing. If all of us covet a flat on Pedder Road, right, or if we live in Delhi in South Extension, if all of us want a flat there, then the value of that thing goes through the roof, right? Whether it's a diamond, a Rolex watch, or a flat in South Extension. and then we fight. We fight with each other for that diamond, for the flat, or for the Rolex watch. And once we fight each other and we beat the living daylights out of each other, and by the way, this can happen without a physical fight. This can be
Yeah,
a
obviously.
fight that plays out in an office boardroom.
Right.
Once we've beaten each other black and blue, then we say, boss, ek scapegoat chahiye, right? We've fought each other. Now let's find a scapegoat. Let's look at that dude over there. He looks like a good scapegoat because he's looking a little funny. He's not wearing the kind of shirt Siddharth and I are wearing. He was wearing a t-shirt, and that too a green t-shirt. तो उसको जाके मारते हैं. And what Girard says is society will find a scapegoat. They will typically prosecute or assassinate or sacrifice the scapegoat. Then they will say it's all good now. Siddharth and I are best friends for now till the end of dawn. It wasn't our fault. We weren't fighting because of each other and our mimesis. We're fighting because of the scapegoat, that villain over there, yeah. Right? And then this is a cycle that repeats, and the most famous scapegoat in history, Girard says, is Jesus Christ, right? He says Jesus Christ was a scapegoat, right? And it's a mind-blowing book, and once you sort of read it and you absorb it, it's, you start trying to understand how much of what I do is actually specific and individual to me, and how much is mimesis. And there's a man called Tom Bergin. He's written a book called Wanting, which simplifies. Girard is a little heavy reading, right? Tom Bergin has simplified Girard's book. Luke, I'm sorry. The book is called Wanting, the Power of Mimetic Desire in Everyday Life. The author is called Luke Burgess. I'm sorry. Luke Burgess, in a book called Wanting, has simplified Girard. And I think it's worth reading. It will give people a perspective of how little of what they do is actually individual to them, and how much it's influenced by the society around them.
Right. Now, those are some really interesting books, Saurabh. I think you've given me and my listeners quite something to think about. I know we're running short on time, so we'll just quickly sum this up. I have two quick questions for you. What's your next book about? You did mention it briefly. If you could just give us a big insight onto it and when it's coming out. And the second thing is just a quick fun question we do with all our guests who come on our podcast. We live in an era where writers, and given that your profession's that of a fund manager, you have a public persona. I do believe that there is a certain part of you that's hidden away from the world. So maybe if you'd like to share something about yourself that maybe the public doesn't know as of now, but you'd be comfortable sharing it now.
So let me merge the two questions. So,
Right.
because the book is about exposing, revealing to the world a lot of what is hidden about myself. So around 6 years ago, a lady in London started coaching me, and by mandate, she started coaching me on a whole bunch of things that I wasn't happy about myself. Right. So, for example, I used to be a short-tempered person. Right. And I used to push my colleagues super hard. I was a brutal guy to work for. I used to work insane hours myself, and I used to push people around me to work very hard. And 6 years ago, this lady in London, her name is Anna. She started coaching me, and over the last 6 years, she's had a massive influence on how I behave, how Marcellus has been constructed. And I thought that was very interesting. That how, for someone relatively, when I met Anna, I would have been 40 years old. So someone relatively mature in life, a smart coach. She's my coach. Smart coach is able to understand the person, understand the person's psychology, understand why that person is behaving in a certain way, and give them a roadmap. Give them a roadmap to becoming a better version of themselves. Right. So a couple of years ago, I suggested to Anna that why don't we write a book about this whole journey? She's obviously done this with thousands of executives the world over. And Anna and I collaborated, and hopefully in 3 months' time, you guys will see the fruits of that, as to how a whole bunch of, I've still got plenty of negative traits, so there's still a lot of work to do. There's a whole bunch of negative traits I need to work on, but at least the sort of the negative traits which were destructive in the context of corporate life, she's been able to remediate those to a significant extent. And the next book is about this whole journey.
Right. Well, I really look forward to reading about this, Saurabh. This is a very fascinating idea that you've proposed, and you generally are a very good writer. I absolutely loved reading your newsletters and Diamonds in the Dust.
So, I'm not sure how much you like reading this next book. It's all about imperfections, flaws, flaws, and the remediation of flaws.
Right. No, so and that's like actually one of the things that I would love to read about, because I think when I said I liked reading your work, I didn't necessarily mean the content. I meant the way you wrote that content is something, the way it comes across to a person. And I think right, and in that, because the thing is, I made a few people who are not related to finance read your book, right? And I think that's one of the best tests of kind of communicating of a person's communication skills. When a person, like, I mean, I might have some knowledge of what a PE ratio is, or what cash flows mean, or what investing is. But when someone who's, say, a newcomer, nausikha jo kehte hain, is trying to read a book and is able to grasp concepts and understand things, is actually a true test of those things.
Thank you. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Right. So thank you for joining us, Saurabh. This was lovely. I'm pretty sure all our listeners loved it. And best of luck for everything. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for that. This is wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye, Saurabh. Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you enjoyed that episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel or on any other podcasting platform where you might have heard this. We are always open to feedback. Do reach out to us in any possible way. We're on Instagram at the rate Kitabi Karwan, where we post about books, do interesting lives. Do follow us on Instagram as well. Thank you.